Well, this week's sermon did not turn out on video, and so instead of just giving you an audio recording, I'm going to re-record the video, but as you can tell, it means it won't be in the church setting. But this is an important sermon in the middle of this last series in Matthew, so I want to make sure that you get it as good as possible. You know, when you hear the word faith, and when you think of faith, what comes to mind? What kind of things come to mind? You know, for most of it's church type things, God type things. You know, faith is what Christians have, believers have, religious people have. We as Christians walk by faith, or we should walk by faith. And so faith has become this like religious word, and so we don't realize just how often we actually operate based on faith instead of sight, instead of proof of whatever sort. When the Bible says we walk by faith, not by sight, its sight is the idea of proof. I can see it, I've tested it, I know it for sure. Well, the thing is, that's not just a Christian thing, it's not just a religious thing. You know, when you wake up in the morning and you walked outside the door today, you know, did you look both ways to see if there was a tiger anywhere? And you may think, well, that's sort of ridiculous, but just a few weeks ago over in Russia somewhere, a zoo, all the animals escaped, some kind of disaster, natural disaster, doors were unlocked, whatever. The animals escaped. One man was killed by a tiger. He walked outside his door, was attacked by a tiger. You know, you didn't check for that, I'm guessing. I didn't check for that. Why? Did you have absolute proof there wasn't a tiger outside your door? No, you operated on faith. You took the evidence that you have, and the evidence being that most days, you know, every matter of fact, for most of us, every day prior to this, there hasn't been a tiger outside my door. Logic says there probably won't be a tiger. Well, that probably won't be. That's faith. That's faith. Now, faith is belief based on evidence. I believe it, I don't see it, but I have some evidence for my belief. It's not just blind faith. You know, take just something as simple as when you sit down on a chair. You know, when you sit down on a chair, do you test it first? Do you push on it, stand on it to make sure it can hold your weight? You know, have you ever seen a chair break? You know, chances are we have. You know, I've seen chairs break, you probably have. But I don't test them, I just sit down. Realize that's faith. That is me not knowing for sure that chair will hold me, but sitting down anyway based on the evidence that more often than not, it holds me, it holds other people. That kind of thing is faith. And so we need to realize just how much we operate based on faith in all realms of life. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." In the English Standard, it says, "Always be prepared to make a defense." What's that saying? It's be prepared to make a defense. And the word's sort of a legal term. If you were in a courtroom, if you were on trial, what would you say? Why would you say you believe in God, you believe in Jesus? Be prepared to give that answer, to make a defense for the hope that you have that, you know, there is a God, I'm saved, I'm going to heaven. Well, the first problem when it comes to Christians being able to do that, the first problem is we don't know the factual basis for our faith. It's just true. Many of us don't. You know, maybe we know our experience, we could share that. You know, God, since I've been a Christian, you know, this has happened in my life, I felt better, I've done this. And those are good things, those are important things. But there's also a factual basis. Why do I believe there's a God? Why do I believe Jesus is the Son? Why do I believe that I am forgiven and I'm going to heaven? What's the factual basis for that? And the first problem is we don't know the factual basis. But I often say in the sermons, just about always, that there's a root problem. And usually I save it for the end, but today it needs to happen at the beginning. Because the fact that many of us don't know the factual basis for our faith is one problem. But the root problem is that many people, many Christians don't know our faith even has a factual basis. We don't know our faith has a factual basis. We become convinced of this lie, really, put out by mostly non-Christians, but bought into by many Christians, that we operate based on faith, and that means that those non-Christians, they're the ones who get reason and facts and logic and all of that. We're faith, they're those other things, and that's not true at all. Our faith has a factual basis. Again, faith, whether it's belief in God, and here's one of the definitions that just leads itself to that. Faith is the belief in God or in the teachings of religion. And so right there, it's like faith. That's associated with religion. That's faith. And so that means things that aren't religious, they're in that other realm of facts and logic. And one of the definitions also goes on to say, faith is belief that is not based on proof. And in one sense, I agree. If proof means sight, you didn't see it. But most people take that and they think faith is not based on even facts. There's absolutely no reason. It's blind faith. Facts say otherwise. Logic, reason says otherwise. But I believe I have faith anyway. And that's not the case. Faith is belief based on evidence. There is evidence for what I believe. I don't know it for an absolute fact. It hasn't been proven. I haven't seen it. But I believe it, but there's a good reason. It's not contrary to the evidence. It is based on the evidence. And once again, the fact is, both sides of any issue is based on faith. Someone who believes there's a God, that's based on faith. But you know what? Someone who denies there's a God, that's based on faith too. They don't know for sure. Someone who believes Jesus was the Son of God, faith. Someone who denies it, faith. It's all faith. And what I want us to see today is there's more evidence for our faith than there is against it. Both sides of the spiritual question are based on faith. There's more evidence for ours. Now, this is the middle sermon in the last three sermons in the text of Matthew. We've come to the culmination point. Everything that's happened, everything that's Matthew is written under the inspiration of God, he brings it all, he wraps it up. And he starts with this idea, what's the most important question in life? It's who is Jesus? And we saw in the trial before the Jews, they originally start trying to bring all these other charges against him. It comes down to, though, they accuse him of blasphemy, of claiming to be God. They go to Pilate, and Pilate doesn't care if he claims to be God, so they have to accuse him of trying to start a rebellion, trying to be being a king. And Pilate looks at the evidence and says over and over, he's not guilty of that. There's no evidence for that. But they back Pilate in a corner, they get Jesus crucified, and even then on the cross, a couple times it comes up, they insult him, they mock him, if you're the Son of God. And then after he dies, that Roman soldier makes that declaration, surely this man was the Son of God. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he's saying whatever you guys are denying when you insulted him, I can tell from what happened, from the earthquake, from things like that, he was the Son of God. And so Matthew puts that forward. Who was Jesus? He's the Son of God. Well, what is the evidence for that? How should we, for someone to say another person's the Son of God, that's a pretty big claim. What's the evidence? And that's what this next section in Matthew deals with. So Matthew chapter 27, starting at verse 57. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Now, Joseph, we see in other passages, was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court of sorts, their ruling council. He had become a disciple. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. Now, remember in Jesus' day, people weren't buried in the ground. They didn't dig a hole, bury them in the ground. They would put the body into a cave that had been cut out of soft rock. And it says he had this new tomb. It hadn't been used before, and by that means they would put the body in there. They'd roll a stone in front of it to keep out animals and things, and then they'd wait till the body totally decomposed till it was down to the bones, and they'd put those bones in a bone box or an ossuary, and they'd put another body, and there could be more than one body in there at a time. And they'd let that same process happen. Well, Jesus was put in this new tomb, and a stone was rolled in front of it, a big stone. And we see in another passage, it's so big the women were worried. How are we going to move it, even a group of them, by ourselves? Well, look at verse 62. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate. So after preparation day, this would be then the Sabbath. Preparation day was the preparation for Sabbath. This would be the Sabbath, Saturday. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. It's pretty interesting that these enemies of Jesus remembered apparently better than his disciples did. For whatever reason, maybe again the disciples just didn't want to buy into that. Their idea of Jesus just couldn't include him dying the Jewish leaders, they wanted him to die. So they remembered that. They go to Pilate. So they say to him, "Give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he's been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." And what's the first deception in their minds? It's Jesus saying he's the Messiah, and claiming to be the Son of God. This last one would be his resurrection, and you know what? They're absolutely right. The resurrection is going to be worse in a sense. It's going to be bigger than the first because it's going to prove the first. And so Pilate says, "Take a guard. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how." And people have debated through the ages. So one, the Greek phrase can be take a guard. It can also be you have a guard. And take a guard probably means take some of the Roman guard that Pilate was in charge of and use them to guard the tomb. You have a guard would be more of the idea of you have your own Jewish soldiers. Use them to guard the tomb. And people go back and forth on what the Greek should be and what the evidence is for, were they Roman soldiers, were they Jewish soldiers. And you know what, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. I don't know about you, I've heard some stories, and people especially, they insist on the Roman guard, and they say, you know, these were the elite, the special forces of the day. You know what, it wasn't the special forces that were guarding this tomb, even if they were Roman soldiers. Now, Roman soldiers were definitely trained and capable, but the point is, anyone would be, any soldiers, Roman or the Jewish ones, to go against the disciples. And the Jewish leaders knew, you know, the disciples. They knew who they were. They knew the number. They knew the area. They would, whether it was their soldiers or Roman, the tomb was guarded sufficiently to keep this from happening. That was the very point, to keep the disciples from stealing the body. So it says they went and made the tomb secure. Whatever it was secure by putting a seal on the stone, a Roman seal. So even if it was Jewish soldiers, a Roman seal that said under penalty of death. It meant that, don't break this seal. And they posted a guard. So what you have there is Matthew's been giving the story, and what he's been doing is just setting up. You know, Jesus is dead. He was flogged, he was crucified, he's dead, he's buried, there's a stone rolled in front of it, the tomb's been sealed, and now it's guarded. Pretty much case closed. It is where it should be. In any normal situation, barring supernatural intervention, the case is closed. Well, then chapter 28, verse 1. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid that they shook and became like dead men. In other words, they fainted. We're going to see them go into town later and talk to the Jewish leaders, so they didn't die. They became like dead men. They fainted at the sight of this angel after this earthquake. Well, then the angel said to the women when they got there, "Do not be afraid." And you look through the Bible, and this is just a side note, but when people see an angel who's revealed as an angel, not taking on the form of a man, over and over it's "do not be afraid," or the people fall down in awe and try to worship. You know, and so many stories today about people having visions or seeing heaven or Jesus or an angel, and it's just this little cute thing. You know, I got this warm fuzzy feeling. And it just doesn't fit the stories in the Bible. You know, the angel says to them, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, he is risen, just as he said." He did say he would rise again. "Come and see the place where he lay." Again, look and see, the body's not there. "Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy. You know, think about it, afraid. Again, they've seen this angel, yet Jesus isn't there. The angel has said he's risen. There's a joy in the midst of that fear. They ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, though, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." And we're going to look at this next week. Matthew omits everything between this and Jesus in Galilee, the upper room, stuff like that. And we're going to see the reason that he does that it goes straight to Jesus commissioning the disciples in Galilee. Well, again, last week's section raised this question, who was Jesus? Matthew definitely, the sections he includes, what he talks about, it's putting forth this idea, Jesus is the Son of God. Well, what's the evidence for that? Why should we believe, why should anyone believe that Jesus is the Son of God? You know, during Jesus' life, he did various miracles, and those were done to convince people. Matter of fact, John says, I've recorded these things so that you may believe. But the problem, the more distant we get from that, the problem is there's no way to prove the specific miracles. You know what? You're never going to find Jesus' footprints on the Sea of Galilee and say, yeah, Jesus stepped right there. They aren't going to dig up a 2,000-year-old bottle of wine and run a test and say, wow, this used to be water. This must have been one of the ones Jesus turned from water into wine. It's not going to happen. You know, definitely fulfilled prophecies are a large source of evidence. You know, that's something that I mentioned last week. We could look at more. These prophecies that foretell what's going to happen to the Messiah, and Jesus fulfills them, and so many of them are even beyond his ability, where he's born. You know, he can't control that. So those are a big source of evidence. But the major source of evidence, the place that you should look at, is the resurrection. If the resurrection happened, then Jesus is in fact the Son of God. Or in fact, people on both sides of the issue, if they're reasonable, if they're open-minded, will agree, Jesus claims, and all of Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection. If it happened, you can believe all the rest. If it didn't happen, you shouldn't believe any of it. What I want us to remember today, it's why we started the way we did, both of those sides, both the people who say, yes, he rose from the dead, and the people who say, no, he didn't, both of those positions are based on faith. It's not like we as Christians, we have faith that he rose from the dead, but non-Christians, theirs is based on evidence and proof and all that. No. What does the evidence show? Did Jesus rise from the dead or not? Well, first, I want us to see there is more evidence for Jesus' resurrection and thus his identity than against. And I want us to look at three key facts. The first one sets the foundation. First of all, key idea number one, Jesus lived and died by crucifixion. Now, you might think, well, of course, why do we even need to mention that? And to be honest, I thought this was pretty well universally accepted, that there was a man named Jesus, he did live. A lot of dispute about, of course, who he was and what happened, but I saw a show, it's been a few years ago, it was on CNN, they interviewed someone, and that person, she denied that there even was a historical Jesus, that he even lived. So let's start here, just to make sure, if you run into someone like that, if you have any questions, if someone you're talking to does, here's some sources that are outside the Bible. So you don't have to go and look at the Bible, they're probably not going to believe that if they don't believe he lived. But here are sources outside of the Bible, and I list the website where I got these. If you want to follow up, it actually lists some more. I picked what I thought were like the top three. And we'll start with even then the lowest. The Babylonian Talmud. Talmud is a collection of Jewish rabbinical writings. So Jewish religious teachers, things they wrote. And this Babylonian Talmud was compiled between the year 70, so only about 40 years after Jesus' death, to the year 200. And here's what it says in one place. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu, the Hebrew name for Jesus, Yeshua, Yeshu, was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has preached sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." Again, that's evidence outside of the Bible for the fact that Jesus lived and he died, and it does say there he was hanged, and you might think, well, hanged, and we think of a noose around the neck. But in their day, hanged was a way of referring to crucified. In fact, in Luke 23:39, it talks about the other criminals. It says they were hanged with Jesus, one on each side. And everyone knew, Luke says, it talks about Jesus being crucified. It's had the whole cross. He knows it's crucifixion, but that term could refer to it because he was hanging on a cross. And so Yeshua was hanged on the eve of Passover. Now, the heralds cried about being stoned. He's going forth to being stoned. What that seems to be is 40 days before, and even before that, the Jewish leaders wanted to kill him. They knew the time was coming, and you remember the passage we saw. They were ready to kill him. They said, not during the Passover, not during the festival. Ended up being that. Well, also, they didn't know how he was going to die at that point. They didn't necessarily know it was going to be crucifixion, and they didn't care. They just wanted him dead. The most likely form would have been, if the Jews had carried it out, stoning. But he ends up being crucified, of course, and it says there, he was crucified. So you have this first bit of evidence. Jesus lived, and he died by crucifixion. Well, then, a quote from Pliny the Younger, because that's the way they said junior back then. And Pliny was the Roman governor of Bithynia, and he's writing to Emperor Trajan, and this writing is from around the year 112. So, the year 112. And he asked Trajan's advice about the appropriate way to conduct legal proceedings against those accused of being Christians. Again, things have been coming up, and he wants to know, how do I proceed with this? And so he gives Trajan his side of things. Here's what I know. He's asking for advice, but look what he says. They, Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ. So right there, his name, the title that he was known by among the Romans. As to a God. Sang it to Christ as to a God, the Christian belief in Jesus' divinity. And bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds. In other words, we don't swear to do wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Now, even that seems to be a reference to the Lord's Supper, and the fact that some people thought when Jesus said, and the Christians would repeat, this is my body, this is my blood, the idea got out that the Christians were cannibals, that they were eating, flesh and blood of someone. And he's saying, no, that's not the case. It's an ordinary, innocent meal. But he's saying there, and this one isn't the surest evidence in terms of someone saying these Christians believe, though. There was a man named Christ. He was a God. And so that does give evidence outside of the Bible that there was a man named Jesus who lived. Oh, the biggest piece of evidence, in the place I go if I just want to look at one place, is from a man named Tacitus. He was a Roman historian. He was writing about Nero's decision to blame Christians for the fire that destroyed Rome in the year 64. And maybe you've heard the old story that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, Rome did burn. And Nero, whether he fiddled or not, he was certainly crazy enough to do it, and he blamed the Christians. He put the blame on him. Most historians think Nero actually had the fire set to clear out the slums, so get rid of those people. And this is around the year 116 when Tacitus is writing, and here's what he says in his history, Roman history. Nero fastened the guild on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. So, normal people in Rome called them Christians. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Now, what's the superstition he talks about that broke out? It's the idea that Jesus did rise from the dead. So it broke out in Judea and broke out here for a time. Well, of course, we know the idea was put forth by the Christians, and it's more than a superstition. But the point is, here you have Tacitus. And realize this. Anyone that would try to deny this, they don't deny what Tacitus says about anything else. He is a major Roman historian. A lot of what we know from this period of Rome comes from him. And they aren't critical of that. And he's not making a judgment. In fact, he doesn't. And again, he thinks the resurrection was a superstition. He's just saying it is a fact. There was a man named Christ, from whom the Christians got their name. He suffered the extreme penalty. What was the extreme penalty? Well, in Rome, that was crucifixion. Now, Rome would not crucify a citizen because it was such a horrible, agonizing death. If a Roman citizen deserved death, they would be put to death by some other means, not by crucifixion. He suffered the extreme penalty, crucified at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Again, that proves it. As much as it can be proved, certainly more than anyone who would deny Jesus, there's way more evidence for the fact that Jesus lived and he died by crucifixion. Well, that sets the foundation then. The second key idea is there's more evidence then for Jesus' resurrection than against it. Again, it's just been demonstrated that it makes way more sense to believe that Jesus lived and he died by crucifixion. Well, the next question is, what happened to him? What happened after he died? And of course, Christianity is based on the fact he rose from the dead. Other people deny it. Well, those are your two alternatives. He either rose from the dead or he didn't. Okay, of the potential ways or explanations for him not rising from the dead, what are they? And what's the evidence for or against? And I list the alternative theories there. First of all, there's the idea that Jesus never died. This is called the swoon theory. It doesn't mean he didn't live and wasn't crucified, but it means while he was on the cross, he didn't die actually. He just swooned. He passed out from everything that happened. And then, of course, means he didn't resurrect from the dead. He just sort of resuscitated. Well, the problem with this, and again, it's not just the Bible, it's historical evidence. Before someone was crucified, they were flogged. Oftentimes they would die there. Jesus is so weak he can't carry his cross. Then he's crucified, and we read in another account he's stabbed. And when he's stabbed with the spear in the side, it says water then blood comes out. That indicates his heart was punctured. He's placed in this tomb then, and a stone is rolled in front of it, and a guard then is placed around the tomb by the Jewish leaders themselves to help prevent any false ideas, any lies. And so the first question comes up, okay, even if he didn't die somehow from flogging, crucifixion, and a stab in the heart, how did he get out of the tomb? Even if he didn't die, he wasn't in good shape. How did he move the stone, overpower the guard, and get out? Come on, there is no credible way you can believe that. But here's the thing, there's a key piece, there's some evidence for each of these or against them, but there's a key piece of evidence in each case. And the one here that you just can't explain at all is the effect that Jesus' resurrection and appearance to the disciples had on them. You remember what happened when Jesus was arrested in the garden? They all flee. They're all scared of what happened. And then later we read they're locked in the upper room. Oh, how do these men change from that to people who are willing and knowingly to face persecution and eventually death? They die for their faith. What brought about that change? You can't tell me that even if this whole swoon idea was true, that Jesus didn't die, he just passed out, and then somehow he comes back to consciousness, he rolls the stone away, overpowers the guard, he struggles up into the upper room and says, "Hey guys, I'm back." That wouldn't be enough to change anyone. Again, it'd be pretty incredible, hard to believe that he didn't die, but if he didn't die, then he also didn't resurrect. And that means that's not that great either. How is that going to inspire them to do the things that they did? Well, another alternative idea to the resurrection is that the disciples just hallucinated. Jesus didn't really appear, they just thought they saw it, they hallucinated. Well, again, some problems there. First of all, he appeared to multiple people at the same time, and hallucinations don't happen to multiple people. Another one, and I hadn't thought of this before, but another one is what he says to them. If they are going to hallucinate and see this Jesus and he gives them a message, what message do you think they're going to think they get from him? It's not going to be start the church. It's going to be that same idea they wanted so long, and they still haven't given up at this point. We're going to see even 40 days later, they're still thinking, Jesus, when are you going to set up your kingdom? Why did they hallucinate this message? But the key one, again, and for each of these there's a key one. If, in fact, Jesus died, was buried, and the disciples just hallucinated that he rose from the dead and appeared to them, the Jewish leaders, when they get up, the disciples get up and preach, Jesus has been risen from the dead, Jewish leaders just need to go to the tomb, roll back the stone, pull out the body of Jesus and say, no, he didn't. He didn't rise from the dead, and Christianity is dead in its tracks. That didn't happen because there was no body. Well, another idea is that the disciples and the women at first went to the wrong tomb. So on that first Easter Sunday, they were so distraught, they went to find Jesus' body and anoint it as they were doing. They didn't expect him to rise from the dead. They went to anoint his body. They went to the wrong tomb. That tomb was empty, and so they just came up with this idea, well, he must have risen from the dead. Well, the problem with that, remember, is Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Even if the women didn't know, which even the problem there is it says the women were there on the night he was buried. And so that's hard to believe, but it was his tomb. He would have known where it was. So even if they went to the wrong one, came back and said he was alive, as the news spread, Joseph would have heard it. He knew where his tomb was. So it just makes no sense. And the other side of that, as far as the wrong tomb and things like that, again, first of all, if they went to the wrong one, there'd still be a guard and a seal around the right one. And so it'd be pretty obvious where that is. And another thing, and this one isn't proof necessarily, but there are two possible places for the crucifixion and the tomb of Jesus. I mean, surely either one of those might not be right. But there's what's called Gordon's Calvary, and then there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Gordon's Calvary, most people don't think it's it, although it definitely, has the look more of what we picture as the Calvary with the face of the skull and then a tomb cut in the rock, because it hasn't been memorialized, I guess you'd say. The tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, there's a church built around it. There's brass everywhere. You can't even see stone in most of the places. The thing is, with both of those, the distance from Calvary, from the place where Jesus was crucified to the tomb, is remarkably short. You know, it's about from here in the clubhouse, you know, if we were there this Sunday, to across the street. It's not very far. It's not like you have to take a turn at the old oak tree and then go right past the creek and up here. No, it's hard to believe they went to the wrong tomb for many reasons. But again, the biggest reason, if they went to the wrong tomb and started preaching Jesus is risen from the dead, you go back to the Jewish leaders, go to the right tomb. They roll back the stone, they pull out the body, and say, no, we didn't. It didn't happen. Well, then the idea that was put forth, and we're going to see this next week, the one that the Jewish leaders started, the alternative theory, is that the disciples stole the body. That's what happened. They didn't go to the wrong tomb. They knew which one it was, but the disciples stole the body. Well, you remember, why did the Jews put a guard there? To keep the disciples from stealing the body. It was made secure with a guard, whether it was Romans or Jewish soldiers. There were enough of them. They were able to protect it. How in the world did the disciples steal the body? Hard to believe they're overpowering that guard. Or, as it says, you know, the lie they came up with, that the guard fell asleep. If they fell asleep, how'd they know what happened to the body? If someone woke up to see the disciples fleeing, why didn't they wake everyone else up and catch the disciples who were trying to run away with the body? So again, there's that evidence, but the key evidence here, and really this applies to any one of these alternative theories where the disciples are in on it, and whether it was the swoon theory or they stole it, the key piece of evidence, and this one I think is just about undeniable, the disciples, if they stole the body, or even again, if Jesus resuscitated, came back in all bloody and half dead, they would have known this whole thing was a lie. And you might say, you know, there's all kinds of people today who live a religious, what we believe is a lie. There's suicide bombers who are told, Muslim suicide bombers, you know, you do this and you'll receive whatever it is, 40, 70 virgins in the afterlife. The difference is they believe that's true. They don't know it's a lie. They risk their life and they give up their life for something that they believe is true. The disciples would have known it was a lie. And every one of these disciples is persecuted for this, for preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. They all but John die for their faith. And never does one of them say, wait, I'm not going to be put to death for something I know is a lie. And can you imagine that? Do you really think, have you ever been involved with a group of people and the pressure comes on, you know, where you're in high school and the group did something, you're called to the principal's office? What always happens? Invariably, you know, someone squeals. Again, you can't tell me that none of the disciples would have said, no, it was a lie, we did it, it was great while it lasted, but I'm not going to die for something I know was a lie. That's really the key bit of evidence against any theory that involves the disciples knowing that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Another piece of evidence, and you probably heard me mention this before, and I just bring it up because to me it makes such a great point about when you do take the evidence from both sides, which one has the most support, which one has the most evidence. I've mentioned before there was a debate that took place between a Christian scholar named Gary Habermas and an atheist philosopher named Antony Flew. Obviously they disagreed on whether Jesus rose from the dead, but they did agree Christianity stands or falls based upon it, and they agreed to have a debate. They're friendly people, friends to each other. They disagreed on this, they agreed to have a debate. And it's included in the book, the transcript is in Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? The Resurrection Debate. You can find that book. For this debate, they had 10 judges. They had 5 judges who would judge them on their content, on the evidence they presented. And then 5 judges, debate judges, who would judge them on their technique, how they presented it. Well, when the debate was over, and again, these were judges they both agreed on. They weren't 10 nuns or 10 Sunday school teachers or 10 friends of Gary Habermas. These were other scholars, other people that they both agreed on. When the debate was over, the 5 philosophers who judged them on content, 4 of them said Gary Habermas had more evidence, presented more evidence for the resurrection. 0 said Antony Flew did, and 1 thought it was a tie. So 4 people supported the Christian and his evidence. On the basis of technique, the debate judges, 3 of them said that Gary Habermas won on the basis of his technique. 2 of them said it was Antony Flew, and of those 2, one of them said the problem was that Gary Habermas presented too much evidence. So thought he didn't do it in a good way, but said the reason was he had too much evidence. So I think I'd rather have too much evidence. Now, does that prove the resurrection? As I say every time I bring it up, it doesn't. But what it does prove is that when 2 of the most capable people in the world present the case for each side, when objective people, judges, look at the evidence, look at the presentation, this shows there is more evidence for the resurrection than against it. So once again, did Jesus rise from the dead? What you have to realize is that both answers, yes and no, are based on faith. They are based on belief, based on evidence. It's not like the Christians believe there's because of faith and non-Christians have facts and evidence and we don't. No, they're both based on faith, and there's more evidence for the resurrection. Well, then the last key idea. Again, Jesus lived and died by crucifixion. There's more evidence for his resurrection than against it. And then the last thing, Jesus' divinity. And all of Christianity is based on the resurrection. And we've been asking this question, who is Jesus? He's the Son of God. What's the evidence for that? Well, the fact is it's not just his identity, his divinity. It's all of Christianity that builds upon that, is based on the resurrection. And again, we've just seen there's more evidence for the resurrection than against it. But we see this. We see that you can't just take out the resurrection and still have Christianity. It's based on that. If the resurrection is true, Christianity, therefore, has to be seen as true. You see it in this passage we looked at today. What was the central idea? It was Jesus rising from the dead. Even the Jewish leaders, before it happened, said this would be terrible if the lie was put out that he did that, because they know how important it was. And then when the angel appears, the theme over and over, Jesus isn't here, he's risen. And you see this when you read the early sermons in the book of Acts. Everything was based upon Jesus rising from the dead. I didn't put this whole passage on the outline because it was too long, but Acts 2, 22 to 36. Here's the first sermon preached when the church begins, and look at the emphasis here. Fellow Israelites, it says, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. And then verse 24, but God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. David said about him, I saw the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices, my body will rest in hope. Because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, you will not let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the paths of life, you will fill me with joy in your presence. It goes on to say, Peter, fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. They're saying, as these words weren't about David, we know where he's buried. Then they did. They knew right where it was. But he was a prophet and knew that God had promised him on oath that he would place one of his descendants on the throne. Seeing that he was to come, he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, that he was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit, and has poured out what you now see and hear. For David did not ascend to heaven, and yet he said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Therefore let all Israel be assured of this, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. All of Christianity, you see the preaching, it's based on the resurrection. The next sermon that comes up in Acts 3 says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus. You handed him over, talking to Jews, to be killed, and you disowned him before Pilate, though he had decided to let him go. Pilate found him innocent. You disowned the holy and righteous one and asked that a murderer be released to you, Barabbas. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. Acts 17, Paul talking here says, for he has set a day, God, when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him, that man Jesus, from the dead. And then later on in Corinthians, Paul writes this: if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. You hear some people say, even if it wasn't true, I'd still be a Christian. Well, obviously they never suffered the persecution that Paul did. There's no way in the world he would say, even if it's true, I'd still be a Christian. He makes the point, if it's not true, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, our faith is worthless. And we're of all men most to be pitied. Well, the point again, is Jesus the Son of God? And is Christianity true? Is Jesus the Son of God? Is Christianity true? Well, if Jesus rose from the dead, then it only makes sense to say yes to both of those. And there's more evidence that he rose from the dead than that he didn't. It all works together. Our goal today, twofold. It's to realize, first of all, that our faith is based on reason, on evidence, on facts, on proof if you want. It hasn't been proven, but there's more facts to prove it, to support it. More so, definitely, than a denial of Jesus, of his resurrection, his identity, and a denial of Christianity. Our faith is based on facts. And then also, the goal is to be able to communicate those to people. People we come in contact with who don't know or who doubt, who might believe, whether ignorantly or not, they've got the facts and we only have faith to let them know the truth. Well, what's that look like then? When we grasp the fact, not only the factual basis for our faith, but again, just to start, that our faith has a factual basis. What's that going to look like in my life? Well, first of all, it's going to give me greater confidence. Occasionally I'll hear Christians, and they bought into this idea that, faith is blind, that as a Christian, I'm going against the facts, against reason, but I do it anyway, and sometimes they get shaken. Sometimes we get shaken. Well, we have the facts on our side, and also not only will it help us and give us more confidence, it'll make us a better witness. Again, it's great to be able to tell people the difference Jesus has made in your life, that you've got more peace or whatever it is, but there also needs to be some of these facts. Here's why I believe it's true. As we start to live it out, here's what I thought. What do I need to do now? Well, I need to be able to share this with people. And so what I want to do is role play a little. And in this case, what you'll need to do is think of some of the things people might say. Maybe get together with someone, have them bring up a question that a non-Christian might ask, or maybe you've heard a non-Christian ask, and see if you can answer it. Again, the answers are there. We have answers. The Bible says we need to be prepared to give them. That's part of being a Christian. It's not just a sidelight. I need to be prepared to give an answer for the hope I have. So practice that.